Alright, bear with me for just a minute here while we get the stream set up. I want to get the chat channel showing up here in the stream also, so let me just get that. Pop that out. There we go. That looks pretty good. It's a little on the small side. Just widen that out there. Alright, I think we are in pretty good shape. Let me adjust my camera so you can see me, I can see you a little bit better. Whoops, wrong way. Let's go there. There we go. So, perfect. So welcome back to our live stream. We are doing Math 105, once again, Mathematical Thought and Practice. We are in the middle of week 3 of our semester. And week 3 is the week in which we've taken a big turn in our content, away from talking about sets, per se, and this week is our week to talk about logic. Now, many of you who are watching the stream today, if you're taking my class this semester, chances are you've probably also taken a course in college called the Foundations of Logical Reasoning. And a lot of what we talk about in this early stage of our math course is really directly parallel to things that you would have also been consumed with in your logical reasoning course. What I want to talk about today, and I've got probably about 40 or 45 minutes to be on stream today. I have to leave a little bit early, unfortunately. But I want to dig deeper into logical statements and forms. And in particular, one of the things that I want us to focus on today is the role that language plays in understanding the logical content of a proposition. Because this is, I think, what screws people up the most, is the translation that happens from the English in which logic comes to us, not just on our problem sets, but also in the world. The translation from that English into something that's more concrete and mathematical, and something that has a logical sort of identity to it. So making that translation, figuring out how the words that are in the verbal descriptions of these statements translate into mathematics, this is where people tend to have the most difficulty. And so that's what I want to focus on today, is how do those words sometimes get in the way, and how do we claw our way back out of that thicket. So let me actually just pull up a text window on the screen quick, because I think rather than having to write out a bunch of stuff, it's going to make it a lot easier if I can just write instead. So let me get something typed in here. So what I want to start with, actually, is I want to start with a logical proposition written out, and I want to take apart the words that are used to describe it to discover the logical content of that statement. So let me grab from my book here an example. No, not here, not here. All right, so let's start with the following statement. So if I just write down the following, so I'm going to put it just right here in my window. Let's suppose that I have the statement P. I'm going to just give the statement a name, P, so that we can refer to it using the logical notation here in just a little bit. If I were to write down the statement, I am a math professor and a Massachusetts resident. Never type in front of a crowd. There we go. So there's an example of a logical proposition. And I know that this is a logical proposition because, as we talked about in our last live stream, either this statement is true and therefore provable, or this statement is false and in some way falsifiable, right? There's no gray area. This statement here is either true or it's false. Let me put up another statement here also. Suppose, let's see, which one do I want to use here? If it's raining outside today, then I with me. So there's another statement. It's a little bit different in form than P, and it's different in ways that I want us to be able to sort of begin to take apart. So the first question that I guess what I would ask in this situation is, what kinds of words should I be looking for in order to really understand what is the logical content of these statements? So here are some key words and key phrases that indicate what the form, logical form of these statements are. So the first set of key words to look for are logical connectives. Connectives are, in logic, the things that are much like the operations that we did on sets when we were talking about sets in the first couple weeks. Things that are used to glue multiple propositions together or to otherwise change one proposition into another kind of proposition. What I mean by these are words like and, which sometimes the word and is accompanied by the word both, but really it doesn't need to have it there. The implication is always that one implies the other. Another word, common connective, is or is sometimes accompanied by the emphasis word either. And not. Not is the third of the sort of the holy trinity of logical connectives. And sometimes you might see a not emphasized with a word like but. Right? So these are kinds of words that can help us to take apart a logical proposition and discover what are its component pieces. So if I look at these two propositions that I've written down here on the screen, I can already spotlight some key words. For example, right there is the word and. And that and indicates to me that there's maybe more going on in this proposition than meets the eye. If I want to start taking it apart, I may have ways of understanding what some of the pieces of this proposition are. It's not just one big thing. Now I can kind of see it as two separate things connected together by a connective, connected by an and. I don't see any of those words going on in my other proposition here, though. So I want to also get down another list of keywords that can help to surface a different kind of structure inside of a logical proposition. If we don't see connectives, we will very often see conditionals. So what are some words I can use to indicate conditionals? When we say in English that something is conditional on something else, right? It means that the state of the first thing affects the state of the second thing. So my employment as a math professor at Bridgewater State University is conditional on my actually showing up to the office and teaching my classes and doing my research and stuff like that. And to say that it's conditional on that means that if I don't show up to work or do my research or whatever, then my employment at Bridgewater State University could be jeopardized, right? So that one thing has an impact on the other. And in logic, we say that a statement is conditional if the truth of one of its pieces is contingent upon the truth of another one of its pieces. And the key words that indicate a conditional structure are words like if. If is sometimes accompanied by emphasis words like whenever. Right? But if tends to be the clue word that clues us into a conditional structure very often. And if gets paired with words like then. So words like if and then can also indicate a type of logical structure that can exist inside of a statement. And so if I look in my second statement Q over here, I'm seeing that if show up right there at the beginning. And it's truly a conditional if the if is paired together with a then. Right? If it's raining outside today, then I have my umbrella with me. So when I look at these two logical propositions, P and Q, that I have on the screen, what I see is I see propositions that are made up of smaller pieces. And they're made up of smaller pieces that are knit together with these key words. I also want to take some time today to talk about notation. because a big part of where we're sort of ending up this week is we want to be able to represent the forms of logical arguments by using some notation. It's going to look a lot more like mathematics, but it's going to be, logic. So to get some notation down on the table, the logical connectives and, or, and not all have notations of their own that we can use. The notation for and is what looks like a letter V, but it's really called a wedge in mathematics. It's a wedge that stands up this way. And oh, I'm sorry, I screwed that up already. That wedge is the connective notation for the or, not the and. And is the same symbol just upside down. So it looks like an upside down V, but again, it's not a letter, it's a symbol. And not, depending on which textbook you're looking at, not is usually either a twiddle like this. It's the little decoration on the top of the Mexican letter Ñe. Or some authors, instead of the twiddle, will use this weird sideways L. It looks like this. Which both of them are meant to be kind of suggestive of a negative sign in mathematics, because they serve a similar function. They take whatever logical proposition is in front of it, and it just flips it around into its opposite, which in logic we call the negation. So we call that a negation operation. So there's notation for those three. And then the notation that we use to represent a conditional, again depending on author, is usually an arrow of some kind. I think in our book we're using a single arrow like this to separate the if part of a conditional from the then part. But some authors, particularly mathematicians, are fond of using a double-sided, a double-shafted rather, arrow like this to imply one thing, if and then a then. But for our sake, we'll just think of it as a single arrow. So there's the sort of the world of notation that we can put on top of taking apart the form of a logical proposition. So let's apply these ideas that we have so far to the propositions that are on the table right now. I'm going to slide this up here so we get a little bit of space to write. So starting from the first proposition here, I'm a math professor and I'm a Massachusetts resident, what I might do is I might then take that apart into two separate statements, two separate logical propositions. One that comes before the and. So I might write that as, I don't know, let's call it R, is the proposition, I am a math professor. And then a separate proposition, maybe we'll call it S, for the second part, I am a Massachusetts resident. So what I've done there is I've looked at this proposition and I've said it's got these two parts. I'm a Massachusetts resident on the one hand, I'm a math professor on the other hand, and my full proposition is glued together. And so it glues together these two with a logical connective. And the logical connective is an and. So I'll reach into my notation, which again, there's my notation right there. My logical and connective is this upside down V right there. So if I want to try and write P as a compound proposition, P, the proposition I am a math professor and a Massachusetts resident, then what I would do is I would write R and S and I would connect them together with that and symbol. So this is again a way for us to take logical propositions apart and put them back together using these operations that we call connectives. So P is the proposition R and S. I want to talk in a few minutes about how these connectives actually work logically. So how do we assess the truth value of a compound proposition? That's the big question for today. But just getting us used to the notation first, let's leave this proposition aside for now and talk about Q. So Q is the proposition, if it's raining outside today, then I've got my umbrella with me. It was raining earlier. I think it's probably stopped for the moment today. It was pouring this morning when I left the house. So that's why rain is a little bit on my mind. Plus it's one of those safe, neutral topics that you can bring in as an example to any math class and it can't possibly offend anybody. So what would the logical form of this look like? Well, the if-then, the conditional structure here, is it naturally splits up this proposition, again, into two pieces, where each of the pieces is themselves a logical proposition. So if I take and write the highlighted part of this here, let's call that, I don't know, T, the proposition, it's raining outside today. We talked in our last live stream about the idea that in order to really agree on whether or not this statement is true or false, we have to agree on what the definitions of raining, outside, and today all are. I suppose in a sort of Bill Clinton-esque form, we would also need to agree on what the definition of it's is. But as long as we all can agree on those premises, then this is a logical proposition, meaning it's either true or it's false. And it's one of the pieces that makes up Q. The other piece of which is the other proposition here. I have my umbrella with me. Let me call that U. Again, we have to define who is the I that's speaking here, what counts as an umbrella, what does it mean to be with me, is it okay if it's in my car instead of in my office, whatever. We'll assume that we agree on all those things. And if we agree on all those things, then objectively we can assess the truth of that logical proposition. Now, how then do we express Q as a combination, as a connection of these two propositions, T and U? Well, all we have to do is use the conditional notation. The if part we call the premise or the antecedent or the hypothesis. We use a lot of different words for that. And then an arrow, and then we'll follow it with the conclusion or the consequent. Sorry, it took me a while to pull that one out of my memory bank. The conclusion or the consequent, the thing that we are then to deduce out of this form. So we'll just use an arrow. Q is the proposition that takes T and U, these individual pieces that we just wrote down, and it glues them together with this conditionality arrow. We can also think of it like a causality arrow. And what I mean by that is that I like this notation because it implies to us that the truth value of T will tell us something about the truth value of R. We'll talk about how exactly in a minute, as we're still just sort of getting used to this notation. This is how I'd like to see it. So also, get in the habit of translating back from notation into English as well. So if I'm reading this statement right here, I'll read this as R and S. And this statement over here, if I was reading this out loud, I would probably say something like, if T, then U. Or because that's a little bit wordy, sometimes I'll say instead, T implies U. I like that language a lot, because then that also gives me the cue as to how to assess the truth value of that conditional statement. But having these little, excuse me, having these little dictionaries in your mind really does help when you're in the privacy of your own home, as you are in our online course. Every time that you're doing math, you're kind of in your own little cloister. When you're reading through a problem and listening to your inner monologue, that getting in the practice of reading these in that way will help you to understand them as you're reading them, even silently to yourself. Cognitive scientists have shown that even when we're reading a passage silently, there is actually a little voice that we can kind of hear in the back of our minds as we're reading. And if that voice is saying the right words, then you have a better chance at having the right understanding of what's going on. So get in the habit of reading those pieces of notation in ways that are extra careful. So our next step that I want to take is to talk about how to assess the truth value of these different kinds of propositions. And we have to talk about connectives and conditionals separately from one another. So I want to do those two things. And then I also want to talk about the question that we got ahead of time in the stream today, question from Rachel asking for some clarity on what happens when logical quantifiers that we talked about last time, the universal and the existential quantifiers, what happens when those get hit with negations? How do we understand what happens to them? And particularly, what's the role of language in making those things clearer, or in a lot of cases, less clear? So I want to come back and do that in just a moment.
Do you have a second?
I'm with my online class right now.
Okay.
So can we circle back? Is this
Yeah.
Makerspace?
No, this is department stuff.
Department stuff. Okay.
Just time approximately?
Maybe pretty tight, maybe right before 3? Like maybe.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. So our next waypoint here is let's talk about how to assess the truth value of connectives and conditionals. So this, when we're assessing truth value, this means we're back in the courtroom, as we were talking about in our last live stream, and asking the question, what's the burden of proof? If I want to show that a logical statement is true, that means that the statement must be provable. And how would I prove it? Right? If I'm a lawyer trying to argue that the statement is true, what do I have to show is true? And likewise, on the other side, if the proposition is false, then it must be falsifiable in logic, and so I must be able to put up an argument for why it's false. So I want to look at both things, and I want to look at them in the case of all 4 of our kinds of connectives and conditionals that we have so far. So I want to treat each one of them in turn, and I want to start doing that, I guess, motivated once again by the statements that we wrote down here. So let me get a little table going. And the first of our types of statements here is a connective. It's an and. And again, the notation that we used for an and is that we took our 2 logical propositions, which we called R and S in the example before, right? And we join them together with this upside down V. Right, so there's the notation. R and S is how I would read that. Okay. And what I want to do again is I want to ask the question, how would I prove such a statement true? How would I prove such a statement false? So to make a little bit of room in my table, let me put up here true if, or maybe true when. And then my last column is false when. So depending on whether I am a lawyer for the prosecution or for the defense, I might have one or the other of these as my goal in arguing for the provability or the falsifiability of a statement. Right? So coming back to my P proposition here, I'm a math professor and I'm a Massachusetts resident. So I march into court and I claim that this is a true statement. I'm a math professor and I'm a Massachusetts resident. What is my burden of proof? Well, when the word and is in my proposition, this means that in order to prove the statement true, I need to show that 2 things are true. I need to show that the first of the propositions is true, and also that the second of the propositions is true. Right? So this and statement, this and connective, is true when both R is true and S is true. So we have 2 things to prove if we want to prove this statement to be true. Right? So you could look at my business card. I've got one right here. Look at my card, and on my card it says chairperson and associate professor, and then it says math department. So, this would be the proof that we would need, hopefully, if you believe this business card is mine and that it's up to date, that the first of these 2 statements is true. I'm a math professor. And then maybe you pull out my driver's license, which I don't want to do on a live stream, and show you what's on it. I live in Plymouth, Massachusetts, so in fact I am a Massachusetts resident. So the second one of these is true. And so it turns out that this happens to be a true proposition. I'm a math professor, that's true. I'm a Massachusetts resident, that's true. And so the truth value of this compound statement is that it's true. So that's if I want to prove an and statement to be true. I have to show both of its pieces are true. Now imagine that I'm a lawyer on the other side of the courtroom. And instead of trying to show that this is true, I'm trying to show that it's false. What's my burden of proof in that case? So what I'm looking to do, if I'm trying to prove a statement false, is I'm trying to poke holes in it, right? I'm trying to figure out what are the possible ways for this thing not to be true? Well, since the burden of proof for it to be true has two cases that both need to be proven true, I can poke a hole in that case merely by poking a hole in one of the two. So it's a bit like to prove an and statement true, we need to be able to stand firmly on both of our feet. And if the other lawyer, the defense lawyer, can kick even one of those feet out from under us, then our whole case collapses. So to prove an and statement false, it's sufficient to prove either that R is false or S is false. We talked a little bit about this on our last live stream, that what happens when you negate a quantifier is that it changes its stripes. It changes what kind of a quantifier it is. And the same is true for my connectives, for exactly the same reason, it turns out. That when I take and negate an and statement, so when I change this statement from a true statement to a false statement, right, then what used to be what we call the conjunction, an and, turns into a disjunction. It turns into an or. And again, that's because the burden of proof is totally turned on its head. To prove that an and statement is false, we only need to poke one hole in the argument. We either need to falsify R or we need to falsify S. We can't do that here for the statement, I am a math professor, I am a Massachusetts resident. But I suppose if I change this to I am the governor of Massachusetts, and I am a Massachusetts resident, and if I apply this proposition again to myself, right, then my burden of proof to show that this is true would be that I would have to prove both that I'm the governor of Massachusetts and that I'm a Massachusetts resident. But if I'm a lawyer for the defense trying to prove that this statement is false, it doesn't matter if I can poke holes in both of these propositions. All I really need to do is poke a hole in one of them. And naturally, this is the one that if I'm a prosecutor, or a defense attorney or whatever, I'm going to poke a hole in this one. I, in fact, am not currently the governor of Massachusetts. And so that part of this statement is false. And as soon as that part is false, it doesn't matter whether the other part is true, right? This part actually happens to still be true, right? But because the first of these two statements is false, it makes the conjunction, the and, the combination of using an and word, it makes that conjunction false, right? Because I can't meet the burden of proof for an and, which says I have to show that both of these are true at the same time. So that's what happens with an and. But the other type of logical connective, sometimes called a logical disjunction, it goes by the name or, and uses the upside down and symbol as part of its notation, R or S. So let's imagine for the moment that I change this from an and to an or. And now I come into court making this claim. Okay? I'm the governor of Massachusetts, or I'm a resident of Massachusetts. Right? How would we assess whether or not that was true? Well, the thing about an or is just like in the burden of proof that we had over here to show that the and was false, it really was just a matter of one or the other. Right? As soon as one of the pieces has the truth value that we're looking for, the whole thing has the truth value we're looking for when the connective is a disjunction, when it's an or. So to prove that an or statement is true, all I need is one or more of the pieces. And I'm going to refine this wording a little bit here in a minute. But the burden of proof is to show that either R is true or S is true. And the thing that I'm not saying, that I should say here, is that it will also be true, the disjunction will also be true in the case where both R and S are true. So I'm going to add in here, or both. So if both R and S are true, then the disjunction R or S is true as well. So if I'm walking into court and making this claim, I'm the governor of Massachusetts, or I'm a Massachusetts resident, then in order to prove my case, I just have to prove that one of these two is true. And I'm probably not going to try to prove this one. Probably am going to try to prove this one. Pull out my driver's license. I live in Plymouth, Mass. I'm a Massachusetts resident. That statement, for me, personally, Matt Salamone, is true. and it's true because one of its pieces is true and the pieces are connected with an or, right? Or gives us the option, if we're trying to prove this case, of selecting one of these cases and proving that one case to be true. And if one of them is true, it doesn't matter whether the other one is true. This happens to be false, but that doesn't matter to the truth of the disjunction. So if I'm a lawyer for the other side trying to show that the disjunction is false, if I march into court and say, I'm the governor of Mass or I'm a Mass resident, and somebody wants to prove me wrong, now they have to prove a lot more. To prove that the or statement is not true, I need to show that both of its pieces are false. Both R is false and S is false. Right? So let me change this proposition one more time. I'm the governor of Massachusetts, or I have won a multi-million-dollar lottery. Fix the grammar. There we go. So here's a new compound logical proposition. So if I wander up to you and I make this claim, I'm the governor of Mass, or I've won a multi-million-dollar lottery, and you want to prove me wrong, then your burden of proof is you have to show that both of these do not hold. Because if either one does, then I win, right? Because then the disjunction of these statements is true. So if you're going to prove me wrong, you have to prove why I am not, in fact, the governor of Massachusetts. That's easy enough. Go to the governor's office webpage. Governor's name is Charlie Baker. Probably my name is not Charlie Baker, so I'm not the governor. But you would also then have to address the lottery claim, right? Because you need to show both pieces are false. So maybe you look at my financial records, which I don't recommend doing. It's a horror show. And find out that I have not, in fact, won a multi-million-dollar lottery. As much as I love teaching and being a professor, if I'd won a multi-million-dollar lottery, I'd probably at least have taken some time off from my job. So that's false. And it's only because both of these pieces are false that we can conclude that their disjunction, the or statement, is false. Right? So proving a disjunction false is harder because we have to prove that both pieces are false. All right, I want to get to these last couple of pieces so that we have enough time to get to some more thorny issues of language that I want to make sure we get to before we wrap up today. This one's quicker. The logical connective not. So the role of not in life, I'm going to use the twiddle for the notation on this one. Twiddle R. The role of not is to transform a statement into its logical negation. What that means is it transforms the proposition into something which is always false when the original is true, and true when the original is false. Right? Transforms it into something else that under no circumstances may be simultaneously true with the original thing. So to prove that a negation is true, all we need to do is prove that R is false. And conversely, to show that the negation is false, we would just need to show that R is true. So let's look at an example of how that shows up in language. So let's consider the proposition. Not all BSU students live on campus. So there is a proposition. Again, this is either true or it's false once we agree on the definitions of on campus and BSU students, right? But it's got this magic word sitting here at the beginning of it, the not word. And not is an important loaded word in logical reasoning. So what it tells me is that there's this subordinate proposition that's sitting after it. All BSU students live on campus. Let me make a little bit of space here so that we can take this apart a little bit more. Because in order to assess the truth of P, this statement, I really need to know something about the truth or not of another statement that I'm going to call V. Okay? And that's the statement that comes after the not here. All BSU students live on campus. Right? I wanted to pull this example in before we were done streaming today, because this is also an example of something we talked about a couple of days ago in the live stream, which is a quantified logical proposition. The word all here is another loaded key word in logic. I'm going to highlight it in another color also. It indicates the presence of a quantifier. right? That the statement that we're about to make, it tells me basically how many cases do I have to prove to meet my burden of proof for this statement. If I want to prove that the statement V is correct, okay, so for an all is true, it's true when every case is true. In other words, in order to prove that this statement here is correct, I would have to poll every single BSU student. Do you live on campus? Yes. Do you live on campus? Yes. Do you live on campus? Yes. And they would all, every one of them, have to tell me yes, in order to substantiate the truth value of V. On the other hand, it's false when even one, let's say at least one or more cases fail, right? If you're going to try to disprove the fact that all BSU students live on campus, you only need to find me one example of a BSU student who does not, and then my whole case collapses. A lot of you who are watching this live stream right now are the counterexamples to that proposition, right? If you're a BSU student who doesn't live on campus, then that fails, right? So this is also a quantified proposition. But let's look back on this and just assess the truth value of P. Okay. Is P a true statement? Well, P is true exactly if R is false. Is it true that all BSU students live on campus? It's not, right? So R in this example is false, and therefore P, which is not R, that statement is true. Yeah, there we go. Let me shrink the font a little bit here because I want to keep it all on one screen if I can. There we go. Right, so to assess the truth value of a negation, all we have to do is assess the truth value of the thing it's negating and then flip it. Right? So not R is true because R is false. It's false because it's not, because we can find one example of a BSU student who doesn't live on campus. All right, let's talk about the fourth way of joining propositions together, the if-then, the conditional. I like to call it if-then. It's a good reminder of how the structure here works. So for the if-then, we had two propositions. We called them T and U before, and then we stuck an arrow in between to represent the relationship of if to then. Here was the statement that we were looking at. If it's raining outside today, then I have my umbrella with me. So let's think about what it would take to actually show that this thing were true. So in order to prove this in a court of law, what I would need to be able to show is that every time this happens, so does this. Right? In order to prove that this statement is true, I would have to have a record, maybe a meteorological record of every single day that it has rained. Right? And then I would have to know that on every single one of those days, I had my umbrella. Right? So this statement is true whenever the truth of the first piece, whenever the truth of T guarantees the truth of U. So T and U are always true together. So T true guarantees U true. That's one way to think about it. But that by itself isn't enough, because what happens if this implication is false? This is where people start to lose the tune a little bit. Let's suppose that I have a record of the days on which it wasn't raining. Okay. Or I looked out my window right now, behind me, and the sun's trying to come out. It's actually not raining right now. What do the sunny days tell me about the truth of this proposition? And the answer is nothing. I learned nothing about the truth of this proposition by looking at the days on which it wasn't raining. Right? We learn nothing about the truth of an implication, a conditional statement, by looking at those cases in which the antecedent is false. Okay? Which means that those sunny days are not enough to prove this statement true. They're also not enough to prove this statement false. Right? And so, since every proposition has to either be true or false, we have to make a judgment call here. Right? We have to say, what happens to the cases in which T is false? Are we going to call this implication true, or are we going to call this implication false? And because those cases don't tell us, those cases are not ever going to be enough for us to falsify this proposition, we decide together that under those circumstances, this proposition is true. So this is weird. This is maybe the weirdest thing in propositional logic. And it is that we agree that a conditional, an if-then statement, is true in every case when its antecedent, its hypothesis, is false. On all of the sunny days, because the sunny days cannot falsify this statement, they must make it true. So that means that what I'm going to write in this little box here is a lot of stuff. To prove a conditional statement is true, there are three possibilities. T and U are both true. Right? It's raining and I have my umbrella. Great. That's a piece of evidence for this hypothesis. Or T is false. In the cases where T is false, when it's not raining outside, we agree together that this conditional statement is true. It seems a little weird, but again, from the logical perspective, it makes sense because those days cannot falsify this statement. They therefore must be evidence that the statement is true. And so if the question is on the other side of the courtroom, how do I prove one of these statements is false? What kind of evidence do I need to show that it's false? So if I come in making the claim, if it's raining, then I have my umbrella, and you're arguing with me, you want to prove me wrong, what evidence do you need? Well, to prove that this is not a true implication, what you need is, first of all, you need a rainy day, right? Because the sunny days can't falsify this statement. They don't tell us anything. So you need a rainy day. But if on that day I had my umbrella, that's evidence that supports my case, right? Hey, I had my umbrella, it was raining, great. So in order to prove me wrong, you need to find a rainy day in which I did not have my umbrella. If I forgot my umbrella on even one rainy day, then this conditional statement is false. So the burden of proof to show that a conditional statement is false is to show that it's possible for T to be true, so it is raining, but U is false. I don't have my umbrella. Right? Only when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false is a conditional statement not provable. Right? So last Tuesday it was raining and I didn't have my umbrella. So this is saying T true and U false. Thus, T implies U is false in that case, right? So again, thinking of all of these logical propositions as arguments, right, in a courtroom, what evidence is sufficient to show that something is true versus something is false, and arguing in those ways, we figure out how to do this. Some authors, and you might see some places in our online homework system also, that make reference to truth tables as ways of assessing the truth of compound statements. I'm not putting a priority on using truth tables this semester, but that is another way to organize the kinds of information that I have in this table right here. I like this table a lot better for my own sake, just because having the words in there, for me, makes it a lot more useful. And if it makes it more useful for a mathematician, then certainly trying to avoid meaningless notation makes it more useful for you too. But just be aware that some authors will have truth tables that try to convey the same information. The last thing that I want to do before we wrap up is talk a little bit more about quantifiers and get back to that idea about how the English language can get in the way of understanding logical form. So what I want to do is just ask the following question to wrap up. Is there a difference between saying not all BSU students live on campus versus all BSU students do not live on campus? Here's two English sentences. And my question to you is, do these mean the same thing? What's the difference if there is a difference? And why people get so turned around is that the words that I've used to write these two logical propositions are almost identical. All I've done is I've changed the order, right? So P here has this keyword not. It's one of our logical connectives. It also has this other keyword all, which is one of our quantifiers. Right? And likewise, Q has that all quantifier sitting out here, and it also has this not sitting over here. So it even has the same quantifiers, and it seems as though it has the same logical proposition that's connected together with those quantifiers. The only difference is the order in which those operations have appeared, right? Not all versus all not. Do those mean the same thing? And here's how I respond to that question. I'm going to wipe off our screen here. There we go. And my advice is that you should start, so think of this like an order of operations. Think of it like a PEMDAS for looking at logical statements. If PEMDAS is something that jogs in memory from algebra. Think about the quantifiers as taking precedence. So we want to look at the quantifiers first. Look at quantifiers first. And the quantifier words are all or some. All for making a universal claim, some for making an existential claim. So look at those first. So if I look at those first, then my Q statement is going to be all, and then the thing that it applies to is BSU students do not live on campus. So if I'm going to assess the truth value of this thing now, then the proposition that I'm interested in is this one. So I'm going to be kind of focusing on the non-resident students when I assess this proposition. All BSU students do not live on campus. So that would have to mean then that every BSU student that I ask is a non-resident, right? And so Q ends up being an existential claim because I want to look at the all first. And the thing that we're alling, the thing that we're quantifying, happens to be a statement that includes a not, a negation in it. Whereas in P, I'm going to look first again at this all that's sitting in front here. And that all is going to go with the thing that follows it. And so here's my quantifier here in the middle. Right. And so if I'm understanding this proposition, then I'm making a universal claim, all BSU students live on campus, and asking whether or not that statement is false. Right? So I hope what's emerging is a picture of difference between these two statements. Let's make a little bit more room so I can write a couple more things. When is this statement here true? This statement is true because, looking at it, P is the negation of something. Let me put a negation symbol here in the front. That means that this statement is true if this statement is false. So this is true if all BSU students live on campus is false. Again, let me make this a little smaller so I can have some room here. It's true if that statement is false. But now we can go back to what we talked about on Monday. That statement is false if even one BSU student does not live on campus. In other words, this is true if the statement, some BSU students do not live on campus, is true. Right? And what you'll notice is that the word some has popped up here, and some is also a logical quantifier. It's the existential quantifier. Right? So to prove that this statement is wrong, to prove that P is true, all I need to do is find one example of a non-resident student. Again, such as yourself probably watching this video on our live stream taking an online course from Bridgewater. You're probably not a resident on campus. You might be, but chances are you're not. So you might be the counterexample that would prove that P is true. It proves P is true because it proves this statement is false. Right. Okay, so the burden of proof to show that P is true is find one example of a non-resident student. To finish up, let's take apart Q. Okay. In order to meet the burden of proof for Q, we would have to show that every BSU student lives on campus, right? And that's a hard thing to prove, right? Need all cases of lives on campus to be true. And you'll notice that these two logical statements have different burdens of proof. I'm going to highlight them here. So this one and this one. In fact, they're making very different claims. Right? That in order to prove that P is true, not all BSU students live on campus, it's enough to probably give them your contact information. You can send them an email, say, hey, I'm a BSU student, I don't live on campus. Therefore, P is true. It's true that not all BSU students live on campus. Meanwhile, Q ends up being the statement, all BSU students, whoops, I'm missing a word here, this should say off, lives off campus. Q is true only if every single BSU student lives off campus. Right? So for P, it was sufficient to show one example of a non-resident to prove that P is true. Not all BSU students live on campus. For Q, in order to prove that this is true, we need to show that every BSU student lives off campus. Right? And that's probably not true, because if you're watching this broadcast and you happen to live in Shea Durgan, for example, then you are a resident student, and therefore this is not true. So pay attention to the order. Okay? Not all something is different from all or not. And that's something that even in the popular culture gets twisted around a lot. So paying close attention to language and understanding how quantifiers change when we pair them with other connectives, that's a really key skill in taking apart the arguments that we're making this week. So we've got to wrap up the live stream there today. But continue to be part of the conversation. I'll see you out in our online homework. I'll see you in Slack. Please do add your questions and comments to this video on Twitch, on YouTube. Add questions still in the Slack channel if you have questions that can help you to do this week's quiz. And we'll see you around. This is the last new material that we're going to do between now and the first exam. And so that also means that next week, in place of a live stream with new content in it, we're going to do a live streamed exam review session. So I'll give you more information on that in Slack as we get toward the end of this week.